So I actually have on my computer monitor a little sticky note that I'll read from because it's kind of like my marching orders for that newsletter for Hot Sheet. Report on what happened, explain, if you can, why it's happening, show how things are trending or identify patterns, and then predict what could happen next. So I feel like if I just do number one, at least with my audience, I don't know that they have enough, like, why do I care? What does this mean for me? If I don't add that, I feel like I'm not doing my job for that particular newsletter. Yeah. And I think some people would say you go too long. Like, I don't want to read 1,500 words on this. Could you just boil it down to a few bullet points? And I probably should put it like a TLDR at the top of every item, but
we can still read. We're people to be able to read, right?
Hopefully. Hi, I'm Joe Beal, the founder and CEO of Microcosm Publishing. I'm also the author of A People's Guide to Publishing, which distills what I've learned from selling millions of books over the past 28 years.
I'm Elly Blue, the vice president of Microcosm. We started this podcast to share what we've learned with newer publishers, so you can learn from our mistakes. Or maybe you just want to learn about the publishing industry.
This week, we bring back a special guest to the pod, Friedman of the Hot Sheet, to help us best understand what is going on with publishing media. So who is reporting on publishing news, and who would you recommend for understanding the current state of things?
Present company included.
Yeah.
Yes. I would say that the two biggest reliable sources right now are Publishers Lunch, which is also Publishers Marketplace. Lunch is the newsletter that goes out 5 days a week. And then Publishers Weekly, which is the trade magazine and website for traditional publishing. Both of them are traditionally publishing oriented. They'll cover self-publishing, but you just have to keep their bias in mind when you look at them. I think that I love Publishers Lunch, and I've been subscribing since 2000, but it does assume a certain baseline of knowledge, and I think it's intimidating for a lot of writers. There's also just a lot of stuff in there you're not going to care about. It doesn't really get into trends so much. If you read it long enough, you'll start to pick up on things, but it might be too in the weeds for the average writer. Although I think, if you start, the thing that I do recommend for folks, if they can afford it, this is also expensive, I should add. This is like $300 a year. Reading the deal reports is really useful if you're interested in seeing what's happening on the ground. So it's a really good education in the market. So Publishers Weekly, they've been around since the late 1800s, I think. They're still going. There's really only two big magazines that cover book publishing now, I think globally, the Bookseller, which is in the UK, and Publishers Weekly. Even the German one shut down, Book Report. Anyway, Publishers Weekly is very straight and narrow. So, they're not, with Publishers Lunch, you'll get a little bit of snark. With Publishers Weekly, it's very straight, and they just try it and journalistically tell you what has happened. And it's really more Oh, go ahead.
Plus sponsored content.
Yeah, lots. Yes, thank you. Lots of sponsored content, especially on the self-publishing side. So that's their Book Life brand, FYI, for those who don't know. A lot of sponsored content. Yeah, I think they're also really serving what I would consider to be booksellers, librarians, people in the industry. And so they also produce a lot of content that may not be of interest to writers. Okay, so with that out of the way, I think Substack, for better or worse, is if you want really accessible trends, market guidance, that sort of thing. There are a number that I follow that I think are quite good. You can look at, they're mostly agents. Like Kate McKean, she does a Substack called Agents and Books, which is reliable. There's Anna Sproul Latimer, which she does a Substack called Glow in the Dark. You have
That's one
to
of
pay.
the people I subscribe to.
You do.
Subscriber, yeah, I think she's really good.
She is. She's very voicey. Like, she's not afraid to be very direct about what she thinks, which is refreshing. I think you have to pay for the good stuff for her, though.
Yeah, because I wish I could forward every single one to about 10 of our authors.
Yeah. The shit that no one tells you about writing is a collaboration among agents and authors, or maybe one agent and some authors, 2 agents. I can't remember. There's a team that runs it. It's also a podcast. And then there's some publicists who do interesting things, some authors who do interesting things on the craft side and on the marketing side. So there's Courtney Mom before and after the book deal, Kathleen Schmidt, who does Publishing Confidential, Jeffrey Yamaguchi. I can't remember the name of his, but he's currently doing a series on pre-orders that's quite good if you're on the traditional publishing side. And his is fairly new and he's ramping up and it's been high quality.
Awesome.
Trying to think if there's anyone else I'm missing. I probably am, and I'll get an email about it. But if you go to my Substack profile, I don't really have a Substack myself, but I do read a lot of them. And so you can actually see the list of 100 Substacks I subscribe to. And so that's a really good measure of stuff that I rely on, although some are more reliable than others. The one last one I'll mention is Ken White. He's a Canadian publisher who does something called Shush. And he usually has a very contrarian take on what's happening in publishing.
So you've got a newsletter that you've been publishing for a million years.
Yes.
10 years?
Hot.
10 years, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And you can find it just by Googling Jane. It's probably an easier way to find it. And you report on news and trends in that newsletter. Where do you get that news?
And why do you do it the way you do it?
So many questions.
Sorry, I had to knock with that one.
The sad answer is legacy reasons that should not be followed by anybody else. And I will be changing in the future. So it comes out every 2 weeks. It's a terrible frequency. It's not a frequency. But I did it because I had a business partner when I started, and that's kind of what we could agree to. If I were going to start it now, it would be weekly. And I would just do so many things differently. And stay tuned when I finally scrape the time together to change it. So it comes out every 2 weeks, and it has a few what I would call feature items. And then it has like bits and bobs, like here are the like quick hits you need to know. Like here's how Amazon changed their algorithm or whatever, or here's the latest controversy you saw a headline for but didn't understand. Here's what you need to know. So I'm trying to save people the time of following all of this noise and just really hone in on here's what you actually need to know to feel like you're keeping up with news and trends both. But if you don't care about news and trends and you're frustrated by following the market, I don't know if it's the best newsletter, but it does go deep on some issues where I think it helps to have a greater understanding. Like we just did a piece on sensitivity reads, like why do you do them? Who do you get to do them? Does the publisher pay? Does the author pay? What if you disagree? So we don't always do evergreen stuff like that, but I would say once a month, there's a really meaty evergreen piece like that.
I would recommend it for like other publishers, like people who are starting to grow their publishing business beyond very small.
Thank you. And then the other thing I do, which people can access on their own, is I try to give regular reports on what's happening through K-Lytics. So K-Lytics is this guy with a team who scrapes Amazon data, and he's been doing it for 10 years now to see what's selling. And because he has been doing this for so long, he has a long track record to compare against for certain subcategories. I feel like that's where you really get the gold, is when he analyzes what's happening in paranormal romance or what's happening in vigilante justice. Yeah. And it's like, wow, this is like, he goes so granular down to like, what do the covers look like? How long are they? Are most of them in KU? Are they a series? What's the price point? And so you get all of these averages and you kind of get the story of what this category, how it succeeds. So I often boil those down to some high level takeaways and put that in the newsletter. But if you're working in a very specific subgenre today on the commercial fiction side, you should buy his reports. I mean, you're not going to find better data anywhere else for self-publishing.
Wow, nice. That's great.
That's great to know.
And I think about it too, like Like there's a few podcasts that I will not name that really just seem hell-bent on telling authors what they want to hear in a way that I find misleading, if not just unhelpful. And so I guess like news media is kind of going the same way as like the specialized bookstore, where like you would have something that like reports on a very granular level. Like, and this was the thing where like when I did the first edition of the book, I really wanted to show global market share by Big Five publisher. And even that is dreadfully difficult.
It is.
Just like currency conversions and like, and then I realized like it doesn't really matter because like that's not helpful to anybody. Like nobody's operating on that level. Like they need to know, do people read books about pies? Like what like is there interest in this thing I'm passionate about? So like, and it seems like you're doing like a great combination of like very intensive reporting that is serious and credible, but also it's like you're doing more than 500 words.
Oh,
so
yeah.
Kind of why, like what I'm curious about. Because it's like when I read Publishers Weekly or when I read Shelf Awareness or whatever, like you really have to know enough to know how to read between the lines.
Right.
And to know like what they're not saying,
Yeah.
but that I know because I've like have a file, for example.
Yeah. Do you have colleagues whose reporting you also especially recommend?
Any specific person's reporting?
Yeah, like that people can look to for views and news.
If you're in the science fiction and fantasy community, I would take a look at Victoria Strauss. She's more of a watchdog than a reporter, but she's so meticulous when she reports on specific bad actors or people who turn out to be good actors. So she's worth looking at if you have questions about certain companies or services or agents or editors. And also in science fiction, well, she's not science, she's backed partly by the SFWA, but her stuff is community-wide, not limited to that genre. Jason Sanford does something called Genre Grapevine that is focused on science fiction and fantasy. And he with one other person actually kind of broke open the Hugo Award scandal. For those who don't know about that, there was essentially censorship over who got that award. And it was really unclear how that happened and if the US people managing the award were responsible, or if it was somehow China. But anyway, they actually were able to tell the story of what indeed happened there. And before any major media outlet was even remotely close to figuring it out. So let's see, who else? I mentioned in a prior episode, Ann Kjellberg does Book Post. And I don't know that I'd necessarily consider it like journalistic reporting necessarily that she's doing, but she goes really in depth with certain issues in book publishing, and it's all backed with great research, a wide angle lens. Like she's so great at looking at the big picture and picking out the trend points and helping explain how we got to where we're at now. And I even learned from it because she's been in the business longer than I have. So I think it's not common that you will get that long view, because maybe people have only been in the business. I mean, this sounds crazy. Only been in the business for 5 years. Like, I don't mean to be snobby about it, but sometimes if people don't understand where we used to be, they can't explain why we're at this moment in time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and this is something that, I've struggled, even like, I feel like even when I was only 20 years in, I felt like there were so many things that I'm like, how did that get to be that way? Or like, what is going on? But so, I guess that's the question I was like trying to ask is, why do you err on the side of this like longer form, in-depth research-based reporting?
Thanks for joining us once again.
Please send your questions to podcast@microcosmpublishing.com so we can answer them on future episodes.
And please give us 5 stars on iTunes and everywhere else that podcasts are reviewed.
You can find us on the internet at microcosm.pub.
On Twitter at microcosm.
On Facebook at Microcosm Publishing.
On Instagram at microcosm_pub.
And here in Portland, Oregon on North Williams Avenue.
Thank you so much.
Have a wonderful week.